Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into the wrong station.
The heat wave stretched deep into October, and the leaves in the hills were turning red even as they browned and crisped and drifted to crumble into dust against the dry ground. It was almost 40, hot as it had been in August, and the lake was bathwater. They were out on Tom's boat, him and a few guests, friends of friends stopping through town on their way to a reunion. That whole afternoon they cruised the steaming lake, drifting up along Cannon Rock where the kids were still cliff jumping. Cliff jumping in October. And then down to the 5 Lake Join where the gas barge was still serving ice cream, and the crab cabana was still putting Coronitas upside down into cups of margarita slush. All this in October, and in the soft blue haze of the longest wildfire season he could recall. The day before, as he'd driven through the hills, alone, he'd wondered that the woods hadn't burned already. They were so ready to go, souls just waiting for the fire angel. Sometimes, when he was doing yard work alone out front, he'd heard the dry branches crackle and thought the woods were trying to call the fire to them, that they wanted to burn, to release their carbon to the wind and let the whole cycle speed to its logical end. He'd called his daughter that evening, but he hadn't been able to get a hold of her. She was busy up north, working long hours, like he had when she was young. He was proud of her, but he worried. She looked so tired every time he saw her. And it was fire season up there, too. After his guests had browsed the lewd t-shirts at the crab cabana, he took them cruising down far shore, where you could still see the black shards of burnt tree trunks rising from the green, now yellow foam of new growth. Along that shore you could still find the usual monumental cottages, but here and there between them were the foundations of older buildings which had burned and never been rebuilt. They looked like the ruins of some ancient world. Wow. One of his guests, the kid, asked Tom to slow the boat so he could get a better look. "Were you here that summer?" "No, I was still working 80-hour weeks up north," Tom said, as they drifted past bare cement foundations. "I knew a few people who lived here, though. Some of them stayed behind to try and save their places, cut down the trees nearby, pumped water up from the lake to spray down everything in reach. Most of them got burned out anyway. It was a bad fire." "Were these cottages or houses?" "Houses, mostly. Back then. And cottages now. After the fire, most of the locals sold out and moved into town." "When I was a kid," said the kid, as if it was so long ago, "we got evacuated once. The fire was only a few kilometers up the valley. The smoke was thick. It smelled like a campfire inside the house." "Well, that'll happen. Forests burn from time to time." "Not like this, though," said the kid's mom. "When I was growing up, we had a big fire once every 5-10 years. Now it's every summer. Or fall," the kid quipped. "Huh," said Tom. But, Christ, something screamed inside him. Christ, it's October. How can it be like this? "Well, it's a big issue, as you can imagine. Forestry industry says they should be allowed to cut more since it's going to burn anyway, and all that carbon's going to end up in the atmosphere. But you've got the big environmental movement in the province, people blockading the lumber camps. And I get that. But if it's going to burn anyway..." He could feel his guests quietly disagreeing, but they didn't say anything out loud. He was grateful for that. It was a nice afternoon. The warmth and sun and the blue-green lake and the smoke not as thick as it had been in the last few days. You only got so many afternoons like this in one life, and it would be a shame to spend one arguing politics. Even the thought of that made his palms sweat on the wheel of the boat. And anyway, how do you win an argument you're not sure you still believe? How do you believe an argument you're not sure you can win? He felt his chest clench and his pulse tap, but none of his guests pressed the point, and they all drifted on in silence past the last of the burned foundations, which yawned like brown craters in the shore, like desert shrines, ersatz Abu Simbels consecrated to no god. Well, maybe. "Have you seen many wildfires?" the kid asked. "A few," said Tom, "up in Alberta, and 2 summers back around Salmon Arm." "Ever see the fire angel?" Tom turned. What was that? But the kid was just looking out at the shore. He hadn't said anything, and he glanced back, confused. "Sorry?" Nothing." Tom smiled, but he felt a little sick. Must have been daydreaming. That night, after dropping his guests back at the Best Western, he came home to a message from his daughter. "Hey, Dad, sorry I missed you. Busy, but we're racking up overtime. I hope you're safe with everything going on. Lots of love. Catch you soon. Bye." The brief sound of her voice made his dark house seem all the more empty. He called her back, but she didn't pick up the phone. He knew she was busy. He knew the fire angel was up there, too. The next day, that haze of steam on the lake had thickened into a thin blue fog, and the air smelled of wood smoke. He'd loved that smell once. It had been the smell of summer holidays. Now it was the smell of being alone. He spent the first half of the day answering emails. Then he got a call he almost ignored, but then spent 40 minutes on anyway. He was supposed to be retired, but nobody'd ever taken that idea seriously, him least of all. So maybe this was what he got. The company, you understand, was in court again. They'd won in Alberta, but the case had been appealed to the SCC, and everyone expected the ruling to go against them. This wasn't America. Not yet. So now everyone was calling him because they wanted to hear it was going to be okay. Well, it wasn't. None of it. It was all not okay already. But he was starting to think of himself as an old guy, and starting to find that he just didn't care anymore. He'd worked hard his whole life. Now he was the age when you were supposed to enjoy the spoils. He noticed he'd been doodling absently with an orange highlighter on a post-it note. Started out as the Statue of Liberty. Maybe. But at some point he'd added a pair of spreading orange wings. He crumpled up the note and threw it away, and then made his excuses and hung up the call. He threw his phone into the crotch of the leather sectional and went outside, drank a beer on the dock, watching the smoke thicken, then crumpled up the can and threw it into the water. Then he peeled off his shirt and swam out into his boat, his stout body bronze against the blue-green, against the white plastic of the hull. When he turned the key, the motor's rumble comforted him, and he cruised the lake, following the same route he'd taken the day before. It was still almost 40 and cloudless, but the smoke was so thick the day felt overcast, almost like a real October afternoon. At Cannon Rock, no kids were cliff jumping. At the Five Lake Join, the last remnants of the floating shanty were uncoupled and drifting home. He filled up at the gas barge, and one of the shirtless 20-year-olds told him they were closing down for the season, finally. Pushed it out an extra month this time, duder. Honestly, the weather's still good. But the fires are getting bad, bro. I've had a headache for like 3 days. Well, don't take up smoking, I guess, Tom said, trying to be funny. But the barge boy just gave him a confused look. You're full up, bud. You can pay at the counter. The smoke had only thickened by the time he settled up. You could barely see far shore. It looked like the Crab Cabana was still open, so he cruised over, his boat smelling of sharp gasoline, and he drank a bulldog alone while the waitresses wiped down tables and stacked chairs. He'd been hoping to strike up a conversation, not in any lecherous way, but just to shoot the shit with someone, find out about their life. But the servers were all busy closing down. Last call came at 3:45 p.m. After that, he drifted out along far shore to look at the skeleton homes. By now, he could barely see them, though. The smoke was dense as pea soup, and he knew he should be inside, that it was dangerous to be on the water with so little visibility. He wondered vaguely how many packs of cigarettes worth of cancer he was breathing every hour, and he found he didn't care that much. He wheeled the bow toward home. Then, halfway down the lake, he came across something wondrous. A moose, swimming steady through the smoke from the direction of far shore, where the blue haze was thickest. It was all the way out over the deep, more than a kilometer from nearest land, and it seemed there was no way the animal would ever make it. But he was so calm, so purposeful in how he swam, with his great antlers spreading like the yard arms of a ship. Tom slowed the boat. A strange, overwhelming urgency was building in his chest. The moose was huge. You never realized how big they truly were until you saw one in real life. It was almost the length of his boat, mighty and dignified, and he felt the same way he'd felt as a boy, sitting on the transom of an old tin boat back east and watching his father swim powerful lengths out into the lake and back. Then, suddenly, as awed as he'd been by the greatness of the moose, he was struck and overawed by its smallness compared to the immensity of the lake, the monumental grandeur of the hills and woods around him. He was in the midst of everything, and it was all alive, and he was just a speck. That urgency seized hold of him, and he realized how important it was for that moose to reach the near shore alive. He ripped his boat around and plied close, keeping his vessel athwart the lane another passing boat would have to use to move down the lake. He decided he was going to shepherd that great animal all the way across, to use his boat and his body as a moving buoy, offering shelter from other speeding boats. He would help. It was critical to help. and as he kept pace alongside the moose for the next hour, or however long it was, he imagined what he'd do if the moose began to founder, and how he'd use the rope and life preserver to save it, and what a good deed, a mitzvah, would be to have rescued that creature from the lake. He imagined how proud his daughter would be when he told her over the phone. But no other boats went past, and the moose made its steady way to near shore without his help, to disappear among dry, wooded slopes. He was denied his chance for atonement, and he was alone again. That evening, he had another message from his daughter waiting at home. "Hey, Dad, sorry I missed you again. Things are wild up here. I guess they're a mess down your way, too. I'm watching the news right now, and everything's about the Orphan Lake fire. It's crazy. Looks like they've already evacuated Farshore. Are you still home? Give me a call when you get this, hey? Or at least grab me a picture of the fire angel." He swore he heard as well. He called her back, but couldn't get a hold of her, and one part of him felt a bright, bitter surge of anger toward her. But another part realized it was his own fault. He'd said something to her once, or 100 times, when she was growing up. You go north for a couple years, you make some real money, and after that, you do whatever you want with life. Of course, being a good father, he'd followed his own advice. But a few years can turn into a few more. And it's easy for your sense of real money to shift once you've got a taste of it. So by the time he finally came back south, he found his daughter had followed him north, up to the Peace River and then Fort Mac, to the portables built on the muskeg of Treaty 8, and to the renovated upper-story offices in Edmonton. She'd gone north, and her mother had simply gone. So he was left alone in the big house he'd built by that deep green lake. The next day, the smoke was so bad you couldn't see the boat moored 30 feet past the end of the dock. A few flakes of ash tumbled down like snow onto the deck. Mid-morning, an emergency alert blared on his phone. Time to evacuate. He answered emails instead and took a call and discussed media strategy for the 100th time. 2,300. That's how many barrels they'd spilled, tainting the groundwater of a town. And part of them still believed that was the cost of doing business, of a strong economy and modern life and a bit of prosperity for everyone. And another part of him believed. Someone came to knock on his door and he didn't answer. He heard them walking around the house, calling out the evacuation order, but held perfectly still in his office with the lights out until they moved along. Then came another intolerable call, and when he finally hung up, there was another message from his daughter. And this time he could tell from her voice that she was afraid. "Please get out if you haven't already," her message said. "Please." He tried to call back, but the line was tied up. He laughed a little, at himself, because of course it was. She worked for the same company. They had the same problems. So he left another message. "Hey, hon, nothing to worry about. The fire's all over on the other side of the lake, and it's too far for the sparks to jump. I'll be all right." He hesitated. Then his last words were, "I love you, hon. I should have been there more." Then he waited out the day inside. Smoke pressed against the glass, and everything stank of cured meat. He drank stale coffee and scrolled the news and socials. One colleague was over the province in a chartered jet, and he posted a photo of Orphan Lake. It was like a mushroom cloud. It billowed yellow toward God and outer space. The caption read, "That's a big one." The fire had lit 500,000 hectares. Perversely, as the day faded and darkness fell, the evening brightened. The smoke was thinning, and as he stepped out onto the deck and down to the dock, he thought it must be because the fires had died or the winds had changed and turned them aside. But then, as more smoke cleared and the gray sky blackened above, he saw the black hills across the lake were lined with a sullen glow, and red reflections were dancing on the water. A slow understanding seeped into him that the smoke was clearing only because the fire was so near at hand that its plume rose directly overhead. He felt a strange relief. The black curtain's weight rippled through 30,000 feet of sky above him, blotting out the stars. In birdless silence, he could hear the fire's approaching roar across the water, like great engines crashing titans. Sparks like flares, like dying comets, fell slowly to drown in the blackness of the lake. He sat by the water and watched the horizon turn, from dull red to orange, gold, and then to nearly white. He let the smoke fill him. From time to time, he wet his throat from a lukewarm can of beer. Then, the Orphan Lake fire crested the hill. It was like nothing he'd ever dreamed. One moment, there was a bright line at the hill crest. Then it erupted down 1,500 feet of slope like a matchbook catching flame. A sound like thunder cracked across the water, and then the furnace blast of dry air rolled over him, even here, 2 kilometers across the lake. Suddenly, all the world before him was a cataract of flame. A great wind tore his clothing as the fire drew breath. And then the flame, red, gold, and colors beyond white, fountained to heights he could scarcely comprehend, before bloodying into a blackness darker than any found between the stars. The sight destroyed him. He watched the woods annihilated. He watched monumental hills burn down to the bone. He was in the midst of everything, and all of it was screaming as it died. And it was all his fault, wasn't it? He buried his head in his hands, and the wind ripped over him in its suicidal hunger for fire. It dragged a moan from his lungs as it passed. Then he heard a clear, bright sound, and raised his eyes to see a figure standing on the water. She was so beautiful. For a moment, some synapse misfired, and he thought his daughter had come home. But she was tall as pines, and her bones were charcoaled wood, and she was raimented in many-colored flame. Her wings spread wide behind in fulgent glory, and she burned across the lake with both hands wide in benediction. The heat of her approach dried all tears, and he stood, not to flee, but because he realized he'd been expecting her. And when she stood before him in her heat and smoke and fog, he reached out to her, up to her, like a child, and welcomed her ashore. And as his skin caught flame, he knew he'd finally helped her, as he'd longed to on the lake before. And as his fat crackled and burst, and the wind bore drops of his fire into the dry grass, the angel moved through him, and past him, and up onto the near shore of the lake, and up through the big and empty house that he had built, and onward, and forward, toward a restitution. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, The Fire Angel, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Rolly, Sky Gwilt, Joseph J. Pierce, Lauren, Alyssa Maynard, Jen Detmar, Jeff Newman, Jay DeBugia, Eric DeBoard, Jameson Olson, and Danielle for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.